how is it that you can have the murder of 45 American citizens, the abduction of more than a dozen Americans on live TV, and the reaction of the best and brightest of our given society is to side with the terrorists who did that thing? Hamas is a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that should be obliterated from the face of the earth. But they're also very clear about what their goals are. I mean, you can read their charter, and they call for the obliteration of the Jewish state from the river to the sea. The immediate reaction of 34 student groups at Harvard, representing more than 1,000 students, was to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And I think that was a wake-up call, not just to the Jewish community, but the American people. If you want to play the game that all minority students need to feel safe and included, then fine, play the game. The problem is, Harvard plays the game, but stops when it comes to dealing with Jews and anti-Semitism.
Welcome to Indoctrination, the podcast that exposes and opposes radical ideology in K-12 schools and academia. We examine the illiberal education loop that is teaching students what to think, not how to think. We speak with leaders across the country about the politicized ideology that fosters indoctrination masquerading as education. I'm Dr. Marcy Goldstein.
And I'm Dr. Brandy Shufutinsky, your hosts.
Join us and Americans nationwide. Welcome, Shabbos Kestenbaum. We're so delighted to have you on our Indoctrination podcast. We thought we'd just jump right in with a question. We're curious, what first led you to realize that there was a problem at Harvard with respect to lack of viewpoint diversity or radicalized education, whatever you might call it?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, that's sort of the critical question, because oftentimes people make the mistake of thinking that this sort of began on October 7th, or people were raising the alarm bells from October 7th onward, when really nothing could be farther from the truth. So I remember the very first month of me being a student at Harvard University. The Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee decided to invite Muhammad El-Kurd to come to campus. And this is someone who appeared on the Anti-Defamation League's top 10 anti-Semites. This is someone who professes that Jews eat the organs of Palestinians. This is someone who professes that the experience of Jews under Nazi Germany is analogous to Palestinians under the Israeli occupying forces. And if Harvard University was an institution that valued free speech, that cared about intellectual diversity and controversial ideas, then we would really not have much of a claim. The problem is Harvard has quite literally never considered itself an institution that cares about those endeavors. In fact, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, FIRE, they ranked 248 American universities as to how well they committed themselves to free speech in the First Amendment. And Harvard was ranked 248th. They were ranked dead last. This is an institution that routinely, consistently, historically, has had a track record of disciplining speech they don't like, of going out of its way to coddle minority students, to make sure that everyone feels safe and included. So we simply decided, well, rightly or wrongly, that's the way that you operate your university. Why don't you apply that logic to anti-Semitism? And Harvard shrugged its shoulders and said, well, what do you want us to do about it? He has a First Amendment right. So again, if Harvard took that approach with every speaker, then fine. The problem is they have only and exclusively used that when it comes to anti-Semitism. So this is way before October 7th. In fact, I wrote an article for H.com entitled Anti-Semitism at Harvard, and I wrote it in October of 2022. So these issues were readily apparent, and it's a damn shame that it took the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust for the broader Jewish community and the American people to really discuss these issues. But certainly I can give you anecdote after anecdote, example after example of the pervasive and systemic nature of anti-Semitism. I'll make one last point. In the 1920s and 30s, the president of the university was Abbott Lowell, and President Lowell tried to establish quotas in a legalized metric of discrimination, whereby they would cap the amount of Jews at Harvard University. And even though Harvard has undergone a series of reforms to rename certain parts of the university, so it's now no longer called a master of the house, it's called a dean or a tutor of the house, the plurality of Jewish undergrads at Harvard continue to this day to live in Lowell House. So again, if you want to play the game that all minority students need to feel safe and included, then fine, play the game. The problem is Harvard plays the game, but stops when it comes to dealing with Jews and anti-Semitism.
Given all of that, and knowing that this history obviously predates October 7th, what do you think it was that brought all of this to the attention of the wider public? Because it's not just Harvard. We see this happening at a lot of elite institutions and prestigious universities around the country, but also a lot of state universities where it's been kind of an ongoing thing. What do you think it was that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back as far as letting the wider public understand what's happening at the university level?
Sure. So to me, the story of October 7th is not October 7th. The story is October 8th, because Hamas is a dictatorial, tyrannical regime that should be obliterated from the face of the earth. But they're also very clear about what their goals are. I mean, you can read their charter, and they call for the obliteration of the Jewish state from the river to the sea. Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah, has stated openly for years that all the Jews should live in Israel because it'd be a lot more convenient to kill them in one location than having to go hunting door to door, country to country. What we were not expecting was the most progressive, the most elite, the most educated, those on our university campuses who take knees for Black Lives Matter, who introduce themselves with their preferred gender pronouns on the night of October 7th, not months after the fact, on the night. When they saw Jewish women bleeding from their private areas, when they saw Jewish babies like Kfir Bibas crying as he's being hoarded onto a motorcycle and deported into Gaza, and saw these mangled, charred bodies, the immediate reaction of 34 student groups at Harvard, representing more than 1,000 students, was to draft what they called an emergency statement to blame Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And I think that was a wake-up call, not just to the Jewish community, but the American people, when they realized, how is it that you can have the murder of 45 American citizens, the abduction of more than a dozen Americans on live TV, and the reaction of the best and brightest of our given society is to side with the terrorists who did that thing. So October 7th was, to me, what broke the straw that broke the camel's back, but really was October 8th. It was the reaction of the supposed liberal left, the supposed progressive ideological camp. And that's what really stunned the American people, this obvious, this blatant hypocrisy, this moral bankruptcy, and the intellectual hypocrisy.
So you've explained the double standards really clearly and justifiably brought a lawsuit against Harvard a while ago. I was wondering, what are the details of that, and are there any updates?
Sure. So the lawsuit itself is publicly available. Anyone can read it online. But yes, we filed a lawsuit this time last year pertaining to the obvious civil rights violations against Jewish students that Harvard has normalized, that they've accepted, and in many cases that they've celebrated. When we filed the lawsuit, Harvard's reaction was not to apologize, was not to even recognize the reality of anti-Semitism. They filed a motion to dismiss with prejudice, meaning they were asking a judge not only to toss out our lawsuit, but to set a legal precedent so that Jewish students in the future can hold them accountable for anti-Semitism. We filed an amended complaint in, I believe it was May or June, to reflect the increasing acts of anti-Semitism. When we did that, Harvard's reaction was literally the exact same thing. They filed a second motion to dismiss, and it bothers me to no end. It frustrates me endlessly that we had to do this, but Judge Richard Stearns of the Federal District Court of Massachusetts in July, I think it was, issued a 25-page scathing ruling against Harvard, writing in part, quote, "The facts as pledged show Harvard failed its Jewish students." He dismissed Harvard's double motions to dismiss, and we are the first case in American history pertaining to the civil rights violations of Jewish students on a college campus to actually go to trial. It's never happened before in American history. There was a settlement agreement reached a day after or 2 days after Trump's inauguration. Trump's inauguration. Although I took part in the settlement negotiations, I'm very happy that two of my demands were met, like the implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, like an official partnership with an Israeli university. I'm glad that those two were met. But ultimately, I decided to reject the settlement and to continue to move forward with our lawsuit, because to me, and this is a broader point I often make, the only way you are going to deter anti-Semitism is if there is accountability, is if there are consequences, is if there is punishment. And signing a letter whereby I pretend that Harvard did no wrongdoing, where I pretend that we reached some amicable understanding, would be a lie. And more importantly, more foundationally, I want to go through the discovery process. I want to find out how much is Qatar giving this university. Why is it that anti-Semitic professors are never disciplined? Why is it that you have departments at Harvard like the Religion and Public Life Department, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, that are incubators for hatred, for anti-Americanism, for political indoctrination? Why has that been normalized? I want to go through depositions. I want to see Claudine Gay under oath. I want to see Alan Garber under oath. And, we'll publicize this to the American people, and they will have to explain, why is it that during the encampments you allowed me and other Jewish students to be followed on their way to class? Why is it that you allowed Jewish students to be assaulted on Harvard's business school? Why is it that a Jewish undergrad was spat on for wearing a kippah and you guys didn't do anything about it? So I am not willing to settle if we do not first address the underlying issues at play here. And again, The settlement is a good first step, but it is just that, a first step. I am not willing to leave this case so long as the underlying issues are not resolved, and I will continue to fight them in the court of law and fight them in the court of public opinion.
So we've seen a lot of organizations and individuals, Jewish American organizations and individuals, really step up and try to push back against the seemingly pervasive Jew hatred that's just running rampant and become normalized on campuses, university campuses, K through 12 campuses across the country. How do you feel, or what have you seen as far as how that relates to anti-Americanism? Because at Navi, one of our focuses really is K through 12 education and the illiberalism that seems to be taking over that education system, because we don't think students show up on college campus and just boom, they are immediately indoctrinated once they step on a campus grounds. We're seeing this happen earlier, but there also seems to be, maybe, I don't know if it's quite a lack of understanding or just there aren't enough people talking about the connection that we're seeing with the anti-Semitism that Jewish students and professors have faced and the anti-Americanism that is tied to it. So I'm just curious what you've seen in your experiences.
Sure, that's the critical distinction, or critical point, I should say. When I spoke at the Republican convention, I was very clear that Jewish values are American values are Jewish values. We're not fighting for Israel, we're not fighting for the Jewish community in a vacuum, but it's really tied to the story of what it means to be an American. I remember speaking at a Trump rally, and the opening of my speech was saying how in 1790, President George Washington wrote the now famous letter to the largest Jewish community in the United States. At the time, it was in Newport, Rhode Island, at number 25 families. Just a nice little fun fact. And he said that here in the United States, things would be different, that bigotry would be granted no assistance, persecution, no sanction. And how shocked, how embarrassed, how angry would President Washington be if he was alive today and see that in the United States, Jewish Americans, as a direct result of their Jewish identity, are being physically assaulted on their campuses, are being told to go back to Poland, are having their mezuzahs smashed from the dorms, are having their classrooms and libraries closed off. I mean, this is not just a Jewish story. This is a uniquely American story, because America has always been a melting pot where different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different religions could all come and make it here. You know, I'm a first-generation American. My dad moved here, I think it was 30 plus years ago, because he was so enamored with the American dream. The fact that you can be anyone, and through your own grit and determination and perseverance, you can succeed. And we are seeing, arguably, for the very first time to the Jewish community, that's not the case anymore. Or at least in certain respects, that you are being shut out due to your Jewish identity. So look, everyone knows that the protesters on college campuses, the streets of LA, the subways of New York, yeah, they'll chant death to Israel. We all know they chant death to America as the next sentence. Yeah, they vandalized all of my Israeli flags. They also vandalized all my American flags. They have torn down the posters of Israeli hostages. But guess what? They also did it with Keith Siegel and Hersh Gober Polin and Omer Nutra and Sigi Dekelchen. These are Americans who are being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. So this is not just an issue that pertains to the Jewish community or the Israeli community. This is an issue that strikes at the core of Western civilization, the heart of our American values and our liberal democracy. When you can have, as I said, the best and brightest of a given society cheering on anti-American terrorists, that is a profound problem. And that's something that I tell President Trump. It's what I tell Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and House, what I tell the national media. It's not just a fight for the Jewish community. It's a fight for the heart and soul of our American democracy.
Do you think it's worse in any particular college at Harvard University, like the Divinity School or maybe the Graduate School of Education? Or are there any groups of people who line up with you to repeat and share your values, or are you really mostly isolated? Or yeah, again, is it pervasive in one college more than another, or is it the entirety of the university?
So yes and no. I study religion. I've been in the humanities my entire academic career, and certainly it is more pervasive, I would say, and systemic in the humanities than it is in let's say a STEM field. That's certainly true. And we could talk about, as I mentioned, the Religion Public Life Department, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Peace Conflict Initiative. There's a shocking and blatant double standard at best, and at worst, this deep-seated hatred for the Jewish state and the Jewish people. At the same time, this is not simply a humanities issue. So there were 4 schools at Harvard University after October 7th that passed resolutions in support of BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement. And yes, it was the Divinity School, but it was also the law school. It was also the school of design. It was also the medical school. And people often say, people I know from the School of Public Health, they are horrified at what goes on at the School of Public Health. It has really become a theater for political indoctrination that is masqueraded as intellectual worth and academic discourse. I mean, you have classes like the health detriments of settler colonialism focusing on Israel. I mean, it's almost comical how absurd these classes are. And I remember I was at MIT, not as a student. I went to speak at a rally. And I visited their encampments. There's a little confrontation I had that's on my Instagram that your viewers can look at. And what really struck me about MIT does not have a humanities department, at least not that I'm aware of. Students go to MIT specifically because of their STEM program, science and technology. These are not students that are pontificating about philosophy. And their encampments, quantitatively, were significantly larger in terms of students, number one. And number two, it lasted significantly longer than the ones at Harvard. And it was dangerous. I mean, you have to arrest students were arrested. So it's not accurate to say that this is an issue that solely affects those who are in philosophy or religion or politics. It's just not true. We've seen it across colleges in this country where students don't study things pertaining to the Middle East, don't study things that pertain to geopolitical conflicts. They study math. They're software engineers. But this issue has really, unfortunately, brainwashed a shocking amount of university students in this country.
Related to that, something that I wasn't quite as shocked when I saw the encampments and illiberalism pop up in STEM fields when I looked at how many international students actually come to study in those programs. So I just wonder if there are students that are coming on scholarship from certain countries that already hold those beliefs and are coming into those departments with those ideas already, and then spreading them on campus.
Yeah. So again, yes and no. Columbia University today is roughly a third international students, which is pretty high. There are definitely students who are coming onto American campuses, particularly the Ivy Leagues, who are already coming from a sense of political biases, of political activism, and social justice. That is for sure. At the same time, I don't want to say it's a red herring, but to me, what an even bigger problem is that a lot of these students are American. They're not sponsored by Qatar and Russia and China to come here. And I don't know if that's better or worse, but it's a profound problem. So I'm particularly excited about President Trump's executive order he signed last week that would crack down on foreign students who are here who violate the law, which is not bigoted, it's not controversial, it's not Islamophobic. It's been American law for decades. If you are on a foreign visa and you violate the terms of your visa by breaking American law, you get deported. I lived in Israel for 2.5 years. I studied in the Eisha Torah Yeshiva in the Old City of Jerusalem. And one of the conditions of being on a student visa was if you break Israeli law, we're deporting you back to the US. And that was obvious. That was a condition for being on a visa. When it comes to the United States, we have this almost suicidal empathy whereby we will allow you to come onto our campuses, not share our values, violate law, harass other students, and we'll keep you. I mean, Sally Kornblue, who's the intellectually challenged president at MIT, she was asked straight up by a reporter, why is it that you have students who violated internal MIT policy? They're blocking classrooms and destroying property. Why is it that you haven't expelled them? And I'm not shocked that she thought this because, again, she's not particularly bright. I'm shocked that she said this out loud, which is, well, if we were to expel them, they would be deported because they're on a foreign visa, so we have to keep them here on our campus. I mean, that is a shocking admission of the reality of our college campuses. Right. But again, the much larger problem, in my opinion, is the American students. And I think it's not discussed as much simply because we have more of a limited tools in our toolbox. I mean, you can't deport American students. They have a right to be here. They're not going anywhere. What we can do and what we should do is look at the underlying issue, which is why is it these universities are actively seeking these types of students? But as I said, there are very few legislative fixes to that because universities, public and private, can accept really whoever they want, Americans at least. And this is an issue that requires a much longer term solution and much more foundational and fundamental change in a way that an executive order really can't target.
Maybe looking into the funding is something that can be done for a school like MIT. To what extent is Qatar funding this on the student level and also the professor level? I heard that there's a correlation between schools that have faculty for justice in Palestine chapters and students for justice in Palestine, in that the faculty are fomenting and aiding and abetting and helping the students to organize on those campuses. So I think the funding and those chapters are something that could be looked into for the American students.
Yeah, I know what study you're referring to. I think it was the National Jewish Advocacy Center that put it out, but I could be fact checked on that. I'm not entirely sure. But I've read the study, and yes, it essentially shows that the rates of faculty for justice in Palestine, or the students for justice in Palestine, increases rates of anti-Semitism almost in tandem. And we've certainly seen that after October 7th. And a lot of that is this money trail. So I always give this anecdote of 20 years ago, there was a Jewish student at Harvard Divinity School. She was my age at the time. Her name was Rachel Fish. And Rachel Fish, almost by happenstance, discovered this multi-million-dollar donation from a Middle Eastern think tank that Harvard willingly accepted. And this was a Middle Eastern think tank, of course, that was tied to horrific acts and behaviors pertaining to anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. And it took Rachel years for Harvard to acknowledge and then rescind this donation. She had to fight. She had to fight tooth and nail. And so I always say, in the retrospect of 20 years, hang on a second. If this was one donation uncovered almost by luck by one student 20 years ago, we can only imagine how many more similar donations Harvard is willingly accept today. And that's why, or I shouldn't say that's why, that's one of the reasons why I'm continuing the lawsuit. Because even though, as I said, the settlement is not bad per se, but it doesn't address those issues. Harvard can still, in theory, accept however much they want from anti-democratic, anti-Western, anti-Semitic countries, and there's just no accountability for it. So there was an act, I believe it was passed by the House even, although again, I'm happy to be fact-checked on that, called the Deterrent Act. And the Deterrent Act would regulate not only the amount of money that these universities could receive, but also the reporting mechanisms. Because we have to remember, how do we know how much these universities receive? Because they self-report. There's no outside agency that's holding them accountable. So Yale University, most infamously, were underreporting how much they were receiving by Qatar alone, by roughly $20 million. So the Deterrent Act would regulate how much they receive and how they report it. And of course, like most good pieces of legislation, it was stopped by then Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and so it never got passed. But yeah, there needs to be a national movement in the political system to really crack down on the foreign money that is being poured into these institutions. And I'll make one last point, and I apologize because I give long answers. The university structure, the way it is today, is one whereby Harvard goes to Qatar, goes to Russia, goes to China, goes to Saudi Arabia, and asks for hundreds of millions of dollars that they receive annually. And in the same breath, they will then go to DC and they will meet policymakers and they will get also hundreds of millions of dollars, this time from the American taxpayer. Harvard receives roughly $700 million in federal subsidies every single year. Why is it, even if you're the most progressive, even if you're the most right-wing, why is it that a university can beg foreign adversaries for money and then also beg the American taxpayer for money? That's really not how these institutions should run, and it is causing a lot of problems as it pertains to, as you were just saying, the political indoctrination and the sense of anti-Americanism that is almost ubiquitous on our college campuses today.
I think one of the things we're seeing at the same time as the rise of illiberalism is we're also seeing a decrease in academic rigor and scholarship, whether that's establishments of departments that actually don't really do anything, or whether it's the ahistorical stuff that actually ends up being taught. So I just want I think it's UC Berkeley that received an anonymous $3 million donation to establish a Department of Palestinian Studies or History or something. So one, that's a public university, but two, they're not disclosing the donor. But we're seeing this just lack of academic rigor and scholarship, and we're seeing that in the K-12 system also. And so one thing that Marcy and I look into, talk about, research, write about, is this loop between the illiberalism that we're seeing on university campuses and the illiberalism that we're seeing come out of the K-12 classrooms. So I'm just wondering if you've experienced any of that. So when you got to campus as an undergrad, what were you seeing from your peers as far as what they actually knew about, whether it's American history, Western civilization, foundations of democracy, Israel, the Jewish people, any of that, not just from your peers, but also from your professors?
Sure. So first, let me validate the question, which is the United States Congress, primarily through the House Education Committee, held, I believe it was 12 hearings on anti-Semitism last year. And we all remember the infamous context-dependent hearing, where three of the leading morally bankrupt individuals in the United States gave testimony: Claudine Gay of Harvard, Sally Kornblue of MIT, and Liz McGill of Penn. But perhaps the most important hearing was actually the least attended and the least spoken about, and that was anti-Semitism in the K through 12 system.
We were there.
I mean, it was shocking. Oh, good. It was shocking because not many Americans go to college. And of that few Americans who go to college, very few of them go to Ivy League universities. I mean, we are talking about a very small percentage of Americans. Now, it happens to be they disproportionately yield a lot of power because they go on to be titans of industry, to be policymakers, to be judges. But point being, quantitatively, we're not talking about a lot of people. However, every single American goes through the K through 12 education system. Everyone, regardless of your political persuasion, regardless of your religious background. I mean, everyone goes through them, unless, of course, you go to a private school. But again, we're not talking about many people there. And to see how blatant the indoctrination there was quite scary. So in terms of your specific question of what was I seeing in terms of students who came to college campuses, there really was a stunning lack of education as it pertained to Israel. I mean, I remember getting into conversations with classmates of mine in classes pertaining to Israel-Palestine, and I took a lot of those classes where they would just flatly deny that there was a British mandate of Palestine. You know, they have a fantasy that before 1948 there was this sovereign country of Palestine, which again is just objectively not true. We're just not talking about history and facts anymore. And then as it pertains to an appreciation of being pro-America, of being affiliated with the West, look, the Harvard Undergraduate Palestine Solidarity Committee, they would have speakers named, well, I won't say their names, but they would get up quite publicly and say, we know that the OG, the original apartheid nation, is America. We believe in the I guess the word is the ending, the surrender of the capitalist system. In fact, the Columbia University Apartheid Divestment Coalition, right now, you go on their Instagram page, and their pinned picture is a quote where they say, our sole goal is, quote, the eradication of Western civilization. So did they get these sentiments in college? Did they start forming them in high school? It's a good question. I'm sure there are great studies on it. But it's certainly a very anti-American culture and environment that sort of feeds into a very circular system. And I think that also helps explain the encampments, but I digress.
You know, I just want to say not enough studies on it. I think that there actually isn't enough discussion on the lack of academic rigor and scholarship in the K-12 system. I think that maybe the National Report Card was published last week. And so people are kind of getting an idea when we have roughly a third of kids who are reading or able to do math at grade level. It's only, roughly like 33%. I think the American public is waking up to the utter failure of our public school system. But I don't know if there have been enough people that are really looking at what's missing and the other consequences of that failure.
Yeah, no, that's definitely it's definitely a fair point. I don't disagree with that at all.
You said before it was very interesting that Harvard looks for these students as they're working through applications. And that's probably true, but it also seems to be the case that a lot of students just are this way because they're already being captured by the ideology in K-12 before they get to college and certainly before they get to grad school. And then in grad schools like the Divinity School or the School of Education that are training future leaders to teach, this is just part of the cycle that Brandy and I are exposing and trying to resolve. Do you have any thoughts about how to disrupt that cycle? I mean, the lawsuit is obviously great. More studies are great. Do you use the word systemic even maybe to describe this problem? It seems to be very rooted in the system, especially at Harvard, especially at the schools that are receiving funding from abroad. And we're going to learn more about that. What other methods do you think we could, or other tools could we use to disrupt the problem?
Sure. So first of all, yes, we use the word systemic. In fact, the opening to our lawsuit talks about the pervasive and systemic nature of anti-Semitism at Harvard University. So you're absolutely right. But look, let's be honest. And in total transparency, that this is probably not a good look for our lawsuit, but the reality is there's a limit to what we can accomplish with our lawsuit, and there's also a limit to what the federal government can do to intervene. There just is. Universities are free to teach what they want. Now, should they be free to teach what they want and then have federal funds? Okay, good point. And I believe they should not have federal funds, but they could still teach what they want. Can they choose to reform their internal policies whereby anti-Semitism is allowed, so long as it's sort of in line with Title VI? They could. Could they teach their students to hate the West? They really could. So to me, the only way we get through this is, yes, the lawsuit is important because it will expose the moral rot. And when we win in court, there will be structural reforms. And the Trump administration is important because they will deport the students, because they will withhold the federal funds, they will tax the endowments, they will crack down on DEI. But ultimately, in my opinion, the underlying issue is what is being taught. And it's sort of analogous to the situation in Gaza. Yes, you can and you should get rid of Hamas as an entity, destroy the tunnels, prevent the imports of weapons and other nefarious supplies. But ultimately, the only way you are going to reform Gaza is through radical re-education. Just like imperialist Japan, just like Nazi Germany. I mean, you have to re-educate the population that is taught in these UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, taught in these schools to hate Jews, that they're going to somehow return to Jerusalem, even though they were never there to begin with, and reestablish a state that they never actually had to begin with. So too with Harvard University, with Penn, with Columbia, with Yale, really any institution of higher learning. The only way we can change this is through radical re-education. How do we get to radical re-education? Well, look, if those institutions wanted to reform themselves, they would do it right now. I mean, there's nothing stopping them. Harvard can implement all these reforms without our lawsuit. But of course, they are unable and unwilling, so therefore we have to file the lawsuit. But they could do it right now. And to me, the only way they will do it is, in addition to being forced because of the court of law, is society. It is when the American people say that we are not going to send our kids here. We are not going to give you money. We are not going to be impressed. And dare I say, we are not going to hire graduates of these universities, because the hatred, the anti-American sentiments that you are producing are not in line with our values. And we as the American people are not going to entertain this insanity anymore. And that is why, whether you love Trump, you hate Trump, the re-election of Donald Trump was so important, because it was a repudiation of the Ivy League values. It was the American people saying we are sick and tired of the sense of intellectual bankruptcy and moral hypocrisy, and we want someone different. We want someone who is going to go in and blow it up, in a metaphorical sense, and is going to do things completely different. And I think that's a really good thing. So the American people need to stop having this fantasy in their minds that Harvard represents an intellectual worth that others do not possess, that they are somehow better suited to tackle problems and deal with issues that others are not, because it's just not true anymore. So I hope our lawsuit is successful. Amen. I hope the Trump administration enacts the policies they've been talking about. Amen. But ultimately, this has to come from the American people themselves.
Great answer. As part of that, you said crack down on DEI, which I thought was really interesting, and that really loops into Navi, where Brandy and I work. Can you unpack that a little bit for people who don't understand that framework is a root cause that foments the anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism?
Absolutely. You have heard this, I'm sure your listeners have heard this, but as someone who is in the classroom, as someone who's dealt with DEI, who knows the professors and administrators, I'm telling you that diversity, equity, inclusion very much does have a binary system. They create a binary prism whereby all classes can be categorized into two spectrums, the oppressor or the oppressed. Jews, American Jews at least, have the misfortune of being mischaracterized as white. And whether it was 4 babies or 40,000 babies who were beheaded on October 7th, it really doesn't matter, because as my classmates will tell you, as they've told me, resistance is justified when people are occupied. I remember, and I always talk about this, I remember having a serious discussion with classmates of mine shortly after October 7th as to whether the nails lodged in Jewish women by Hamas on October 7th constituted rape. I was of the position they did, and my classmates, many of whom were organizers of the 2017 Women's March, all of whom I assume voted for Kamala Harris, many of them who have abortion and reproductive rights as their number one issue, or at least one of their issues, they were of the position that no, it didn't. And through Harvard Chabad, we brought that 47-minute Hamas snuff video to our campus because we felt that on our campus, more than other campuses, it was imperative for students to see this video, see pure, unadulterated evil. Number one, the president at the time, Claudine Gay, did not show up. And number two, of the, I don't know, maybe 400 to 500 people who came, maybe it was a little less, almost all of them were Jews. It was people like me who really didn't need to see it. Because again, you can show people the most horrific pictures and images. I'm thinking them in my head right now, but it's just really not going to sway people because it all falls through the prism of being oppressed. And I'll close by saying this anecdote that really highlights this. When Luigi Mangione killed the United Healthcare CEO in broad daylight on the streets of Manhattan, almost the entirety of the American people condemned it. This is evil. This is an assassination, with one outlier, with one exception. That was young people. That was people between the ages of 18 and 26 who overwhelmingly supported what he did. Why? Because Luigi is part of an oppressed class that, because he is a victim of some undefinable, intangible force of the oppressing class, whatever that means, he therefore can basically do what he wants.
Except that he's not. Sorry, except that he's not, right? He went to a wonderful private school, right?
Because it is all, except for he's not, right? He comes from wealth, he comes from privilege. Correct. He comes from privilege, comes from wealth. He never lacked. But because in the mind of the liberal ideology, he was in some ways oppressed or victimized through the healthcare system, through the elites, through this global ruling class. He could kill him, and that would be an acceptable response. He was given a free pass by our college campuses, by the media, by the left, because what else are you going to do? How else should they resist? Resistance is justified when people are occupied.
As opposed to healthy dialogue.
I think it just really spells or should hopefully serve and has as a wake-up call, maybe the election and exit polling answers that American voters gave will be an indicator that some people maybe take into consideration, because it points to a level of moral bankruptcy when rape is justified or assassination is justified if somebody has the right or wrong identity. And we talk about and have talked about the changes in the education system all over the Middle East, from taking out the anti-Semitic texts in places like Saudi Arabia to what needs to happen to the, I guess, former UNRWA schools, since UNRWA is likely going to go away soon. But I think that we will need to do something similar here. I'm a mom of four, 2 grown kids have already gone through college. They've had to go through, orientation. You go through the sexual assault prevention, domestic violence, dating violence training, all of those things as part of orientation. But now we have a group of young people that will justify the very things that, previous generations worked and advocated for victims of. I just think it's going to be something that we're going to have to tackle here, not just abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there needs to be some serious introspection, let's say, as to how we got to this. Yeah.
Do you think that there is a way for us to or what is the best way for us to reach people for whom what we're saying seems conspiratorial, because it's so absurd that somebody would justify rape, that I think most normal liberal-minded people would say, that's ridiculous. I don't believe you. That's hyperbole. It's so outside the box that I think people just kind of dismiss or shut down, even though that is in fact what's happening. Maybe some of these new documentary films that are coming out can be more widely shown so people can see the actual footage, maybe more one-on-one conversations, new student groups on campus. I don't know. There's got to be some way to get the word out before it's even more too late.
Yeah. So again, with many of my answers, yes and no. I always say that there's roughly 10 to 20% of a population, of a society, of a campus that you will literally never be able to convince of anything. These are people who will tell you that the nails lodged in Jewish women by Hamas either did not happen, but if they did happen, it was totally excused. So I always tell students, don't focus on the 10 to 20%. Focus on the 80 to 90%. And there really is, I don't know if silent majority is the appropriate term, but there certainly is a quantitatively far more significant amount of the campus that can be swayed or don't necessarily have a particular policy position on this issue, or may not even know. I don't know how many of them can even point to Israel on a map, especially in the pro-Palestine side, but that's a different story. In terms of how we educate that 80 to 90%, I'm not an educator. I'm a nerd who wrote mediocre research papers on October 6th. And I'm still a nerd, although I write a little less mediocre research papers. But I don't know. What I do know is I don't think we have the luxury of not throwing everything we can at the wall and see what sticks. If it can be those documentaries, great. If it can be one-on-one conversations, great. If it can be social media, great. If it can be the legislative process or litigation, whatever people think could work, then just do it. But I do not think, as I said, we have the luxury or we have the privilege to wait and strategize, because we are outnumbered, we are outgunned, and it is getting worse and worse, especially in the battleground of ideas, the longer we wait.
And we're outfunded. And I take a different approach. Resources are finite. I'm not trying to convince anybody. What I am trying to do is make sure that even if they're in the minority, that they don't have the power to hurt us. And right now, what we're seeing on college campuses is administrators are bending the knee to the loud, violent minority.
Yes, and that's why if a particular group, if a particular organization thinks that confronting the protesters is worthwhile, then they should do that, and they should get the funding to do that. If another organization thinks that no, you only get this through dialogue, then they should do that. And we'll see what works. But the underlying issue is that what we have been doing in the past clearly hasn't worked, because just look at our college campuses. And I get, weirdly enough, the most trouble I ever get in is not when I'm discussing the anti-Israel caucus. It's when I discuss the Jewish nonprofits and the Jewish establishment. That's when I get the most criticism and the most hate, because how dare you criticize during this time where we as a community need to be more united now more than ever. And that really stifles dissent. It forbids any type of public or constructive criticism. And that to me is a shame, because I want all these organizations to succeed, but they're not going to be able to unless they actually hear feedback. Certainly feedback from the students who are on the front lines and are experiencing it the most, and probably know how to alleviate these concerns the most. So it's a big shame. And I think there needs to be a public inquiry in Israel as to the events of October 7th and the response, and somewhat on a less intense scale, but there does need to be a public inquiry in the United States within the Jewish community of the Jewish nonprofit space raises billions of dollars annually. What are they doing with the money? And why were we so unprepared for October 7th?
I'll say something hopefully politically correct enough on that. I honestly don't think that the large mainstream organizations are outfitted to address this problem. I don't think they were. I don't think they were before. I don't think they are now. I think by and large, American Jews were looking to organizations to help that just weren't set up to function in that way. They were set up to deal with a specific type of anti-Semitism, and that is not what we're seeing. I mean, they were set up to deal with anti-Semitism that still exists, but that's not what kids are facing in K-12. That's not what college students are facing on campus. That's not what Jewish professors who are being chased out of the profession are facing. They're facing a different, a contemporary anti-Semitism, and I just don't think that those mainstream orgs have been were set up to address it.
Okay.
Even though many of them are still attempting to and trying to, I don't. Their slow response or really quick reversion back to what they were doing on October 6th, we've seen it over the past 16 months.
Yeah, it's a damning indictment on the Jewish community, but at the same time, I look at young American Jews who are fighting it even without the funding, even without the resources, even without the training, and that to me is quite inspiring. And it is young American Jews who I always say are going to fix the problems that our generation did not create.
And some of us old ones too.
Some of the old ones too, yes.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think you can consider yourself an educator. I've heard you speak so many times that I think it's warranted. You're not just a book nerd. So thank you so much for your incredible courage and voice. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful, illuminating conversation. We will follow your lawsuit and look forward to celebrating a win.
Amen. Amen. We'll all be celebrating together. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to support our work, subscribe to YouTube and follow us on our socials. The links are in the description.